courtroom went silent when Judge Harold Whitmore slammed his gavel and barked, "Remove that silver star, you don't deserve it here." Amara Lewis, a Navy SEAL who lost her leg saving fellow soldiers, didn't flinch. Instead, she set in motion a plan that would pull the judge's darkest secrets into the light. What kind of hidden power could turn one woman's defiance into the end of a judge's career? I remember the taste of cold air in that courtroom as clearly as the sound of the gavel. Winter had pushed its gray shoulders against the windows, and the benches were packed veterans in press jackets with small rows of ribbons, local reporters clutching recorders, neighbors who'd skipped work to see a story. The wood creaked every time someone shifted. You could hear people breathing. It felt like standing on a dock before a storm, no wind yet, but the water already tightening. Judge Harold Whitmore came in like a verdict no one had asked for. The black robe skimmed the floor, his jaw set the way men set their jaws when they believe walls and ceilings belong to them. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just took the high seat and swept the room with a look that told us he'd already decided what this day was going to be. Later, I'd learned things I wish I hadn't: names of companies whispered in hallways, favors traded in back offices, Iron Shield Logistics, leaning in from the shadows, and asking the judge to make an example before the rest of the veterans made trouble. But in that second, all we had was the man, the robe, and the hammer in his hand. Amara Lewis rolled forward in her chair, quiet as a drawn breath. White uniform, polished shoes, silver star catching the light like a small sunrise. You didn't need to know the whole story to feel it, how that ribbon wasn't just ribbon, how something had been paid for dearly. A couple of vets near me straightened without meaning to. One touched the rim of his cap, quick and shy, as if saluting might break the spine of the moment. There was no introduction, no clearing of the throat. The judge lifted the gavel and brought it down with a crack that made the microphones rattle. "Remove that silver star," he said, voice cold enough to frost glass. "You don't deserve it in my courtroom." The words didn't echo, they landed. A reporter 2 rows up dropped her pen, and it skittered under the bench in a sound that somehow seemed rude, like a laugh in a church. An old veteran in front of me clenched both fists until his knuckles went the color of paper. Somewhere in the back, a woman gasped, then caught herself and pressed a hand to her mouth as if she could pull the sound back in. Amara didn't flinch. She reached up and laid her palm over the metal, a simple, unhurried gesture more protective than defiant. Her face didn't change. If anything, the stillness around her sharpened as if she had just stepped onto familiar ground. There are people who carry quiet like a shield. That was Amara. The judge's gaze tried to push her back into the chair, but it was like pushing a nail into stone. "You heard the court," Whitmore said, a little louder now. He looked past her to the bailiff, who shifted, caught between orders and the taste of bad optics. Time stretched. You could feel the room choose sides without moving a muscle. Amara spoke finally, and her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady in a way that made phones lift and heads tilt forward. "I lost a part of my body to keep that flag standing," she said. "You don't get to take this from me." The line didn't soar. It didn't need to. It was a hammer, not a flourish. For a heartbeat, everything else disappeared. The judge on his platform, the brass rail, the microphones, the wet tracks of snow by the door. There was only the woman and the metal, and a country somewhere in between. Whitmore's mouth thinned. I saw it, a blink too slow, a spark of something that wasn't just anger. Fear, maybe. The kind that flares when a script slips out of your hands. He lifted the gavel again, then felt the room looking at him. Cameras, veterans, me with my notebook, and the sudden certainty that I was witnessing a before and after. "You are out of order," he said. "This court will not be made into a place where I'm small." Amara finished for him, almost gentle. "I won't be small for you." The old vet in front of me let out a breath he'd been holding since 1972. A young reporter whispered, "Oh my God," into her sleeve. The bailiff took a half step and then stopped dead, his training and his sense of the moment colliding in his shoes. The judge glanced to his left, to his clerk, then down at a stack of papers as if paper could rescue him. The robe looked heavier than it had a minute earlier. I watched him look for the power he had always found: habit posture, the stale gravity of office, and come up with less than he expected. That's the thing about power, it sits there until someone dares to not give it back. "Remove it," he said again, but he didn't pound the gavel. He didn't call security. He just repeated himself softer, like he was trying to convince the room that the first command hadn't bounced. Amara didn't repeat anything. She just stayed hand on the metallized level. I can tell you there are moments when truth feels like weather. It moves through a place and adjusts the temperature. This was one of those. The entire courtroom recalibrated around her refusal like furniture shifting during an earthquake. Somewhere behind me, a man muttered, "This is wrong," and it hung in the air because we all knew it, even the ones who'd come for spectacle, even the ones who liked the judge. Whitmore's jaw flexed. The clerk leaned toward him, murmured something that made his eyes flash. An angle, a rule, a way out. He nodded once, clipped. "Fine," he said, "we'll proceed." But the damage was done, and he knew it. You don't try to strip a hero in public and walk away unmarked. He settled back, but the robe didn't fit the same. His hands fussed with the edge of the bench, then stilled. That's when the questions started for me. Quiet at first, then louder. Why this order? Why her? Why today? Later there would be whispers in the corridor about Iron Shield and favors owed, about calls placed late at night from numbers that didn't belong to anyone. Later I would hear the phrase, "make an example," and feel the sting of it in my teeth. But in that hour, all we had was the present tense, a judge who had overreached a veteran who would not bend, and a room full of witnesses who would carry what they saw out into the cold. "State your name for the record," the judge said, pretending the earth hadn't moved. "Amara Lewis," she answered, as if names could be anchors. Her hand fell from the metal to her lap, but the message stayed where everyone could see it. I looked at the door. People had stopped coming in. No one was leaving. The storm hadn't broken, not yet. It was gathering above the high windows in the hallways and the phones lighting up along the benches. I wrote one line in my notebook and underlined it twice. He picked the wrong soldier. And if you'd been there, you would have felt it too. The sense that this wasn't just a hearing. It was the start of a reckoning. The kind that follows you out into the street, down the steps, slick with snow, into a city that suddenly feels smaller than the truth you've just heard. I didn't learn who Amara Lewis really was in that courtroom. I learned it later piecemeal, the way the truth sometimes arrives, a page from an after-action report, a whispered story from a medic, a 10-second clip of helmet cam that the Pentagon never released, but that every survivor can still see in sleep. When I fit those pieces together, Syria 2019 wasn't a headline anymore. It was heat and grit and the sharp taste of metal on the tongue. They'd been moving at night, no moon, just the ghostly green of NVGs and the breathy click of radios. A team of 6 threading a dry riverbed toward a compound that looked like a tooth knocked loose from the desert. The plan was simple in the way plans get simple when time is short. Find the room with the Americans, cut the lock by 15 minutes of sky. A drone circled high, a dull eye in a bright oven. Someone murmured, "Winds shifting." Someone else said, "Copy," and the dark pressed close, intimate as a hand on the back of your neck. Then everything broke open. The first fire came from the left, rude, impatient. Tracers stitched the air in orange dashes. The team dropped, returned, advanced. The world got small, a few yards of dirt. 3 voices you trust, the itch of sweat at the base of your helmet. A door, a hinge. The taste of adrenaline like a coin. Inside the compound, it was worse. A room with 2 cots, a bucket, a smell no one forgets. Hands moved fast. Bolt cutters bit metal. Someone said 2 words nobody remembers, and then a child yelled outside, and all hell had perfect aim. In every story, there's a second that comes with a sound. This one arrived with a bang that threw everyone backward and stripped the air of oxygen. The courtyard erupted. The wall coughed sand and rebar. Later, the report would call it a pressure-activated device disguised as rubble along the egress path. On the ground, it was an ugly light, a shove of silence. Amara felt it first as absence, the weight of a body she'd always trusted, suddenly not there. She hit the earth, and the earth hit back. Her radio screamed without words. Someone crawled, someone didn't. In that kind of moment, time both collapses and opens wide. A medic slid into the frame like he'd practiced for this his whole life. Tourniquet pressure, breath in, curse out. Amara tried to sit and couldn't. When she propped herself on her elbows, she saw what wasn't where it had always been, and the brain did what brains do when reality arrives too fast, it argued. That leg has carried you across training grounds, through salt water into fire. It's here. It's here. A heartbeat later, pain called roll, and the denial left the room. She told a chaplain later that the strangest thing was the color. Not red like a flag, but darker, thicker, a tide that belonged to the earth more than to her. It pooled in the grooves of the courtyard and slid into the desert's throat. Someone shouted her name. Someone else kept count. The sky tilted, boots scraped. A body fell across her to turn her to shield her from a second blast that might or might not come. That body belonged to a teammate who would not go home. He was 27 and had a laugh that could pry open a bad day. The blast had stolen his laugh, but not his last job. Cover her eyes. Keep her here. They lifted her onto a board that felt both too soft and too hard. The drone shifted its orbit. The radio found a word that meant now. The helo came in dirty and loud, and the desert flicked its grit against the rotors like 1,000 tiny fists. On the flight, the medic kept talking. Don't look, stay with me, you're good. We're good as if words could weld a person to this side of the line. In the field hospital, under lights that made everyone look like they'd been painted with chalk, Amara came back and went away and came back again. When she finally stayed, it was because a nurse with hands like competent weather said her name as if it were a promise. Lewis, she said, you're here. And here, as it turned out, was not where she'd started. I have only one clear image from the days that followed, but it's enough. Amara in a narrow bed, bandages, clean face, pale and chapped, staring at the wall as if it were a horizon line she could walk to if she wanted it bad enough. On the table beside her, laid careful as a relic, a small rectangle of ribbon and metal in a plastic case. A teammate, one of the two who lived, had brought it in against rules and reason, because sometimes rules are too small for what needs to be done. He set it down and said nothing. They both looked at it, and the room got full of people who weren't there, and the air changed. She didn't say much. She doesn't even now. But I'm told that when she finally spoke, her voice had sand in it. This doesn't belong to me, she said, touching the case with 2 fingers. It belongs to them. It stays on my chest until I can hand it back. No one corrected her. In the service, you learn there are sentences that don't want your grammar. They want your silence. Rehab was a grind hours that redefined the word. The world shrank to inches, the distance between parallel bars, the exact angle of a socket, the stubborn tenderness of skin learning a new shape. Pain became a roommate that didn't pay rent. Pride changed clothes and came back as patience. She counted tile lines, learned balance all over again, found out which jokes worked on mornings when nothing else did. And the quiet, God, the quiet. In that quiet, she built something most of us never have to build, a calm that is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to be steered by it. That's the piece people missed when they watched her in the courtroom and called her brave like it was fireworks. The stillness wasn't a show. It was architecture she'd erected brick by brick when the world tried to take more than a limb. Syria taught her a geometry of danger, how to measure rooms and men, and moments, how to know when standing your ground is not a metaphor, but a math problem you can solve with breath. So when Judge Whitmore told her to take off the medal, she wasn't hearing a command. She was hearing a test she'd already passed. She put her hand over the silver star, not because it needed protecting, but because the living sometimes needs a signal to the dead. I remember you. I will not make you small to make him comfortable. If you were in that courtroom, you felt the distance between 2019 and now collapse until they touched. The heat, the grit, the noise without air, and then the quiet of a woman who learned in a country of blood and sand that dignity is a thing you can keep even when the rest has been taken. That's why she didn't shake. That's why the judge did. I was one of the last to leave the courtroom, notebook tucked under my arm like a thin shield. The hallway breathed us out into the cold, and the front steps of the courthouse were still who just did something impossible. She moved carefully, chair humming, over the stone lip of the threshold, uniform crisp, silver star catching a tired sun. That's when the 2 officers peeled away from the pillar at the bottom of the stairs as if they'd been waiting for a cue. Ethan Cross, square jaw, neat fade, a posture that read permanent permission, and Ryan Doyle, leaner, meaner, the kind of smirk that makes bystanders brace without deciding to. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. The posture did the talking, first blocking the ramp like a gate. Cross tilted his head, glanced at the medal, and let the line drop with the lazy cruelty of someone tossing trash. Nice trinket, he said. Did you get it with food stamps? A few people gasped. A veteran to my left muttered a prayer that didn't ask for much, just restraint. Doyle laughed through his nose and added, almost conversational, some folks should stick to mops, not medals. There are insults you can shrug off and insults designed to find the seam in your skin. These were the second kind. You could feel the air tilt. A woman in a peacoat lifted her phone, then lowered it, then lifted it again, not sure whether caution or duty had the right of way. Amara didn't rise to it. She didn't need to. She simply rested her palms on the wheels to hold herself steady and raised her chin a fraction. Nothing dramatic. When she spoke, it wasn't loud, but it carried like clean water. "History has already passed you," she said. That line landed with the quietest sort of violence. Not a punch. A verdict. Cross flushed a shade that doesn't have a decent name. Doyle leaned closer, like proximity could make her smaller. It didn't. Every veteran on the steps stood another half-inch taller without moving a foot. That's when I noticed him, a kid on the lower step, maybe early 20s, dark curls under a beat-up beanie, brown eyes wide and wet with adrenaline. He held a phone in both hands as if it were a compass. Luis Vega, though, I didn't know his name yet. His fingers shook, but the frame was steady, and his mouth was a hard line, the kind people get when they finally decide they're not going to blink. "Back up," Cross said to no one, and to everyone, voice taking on the starch of authority. "You're obstructing." But no one was obstructing anything. The obstruction was two uniforms in a doorway, meant for the public. Luis didn't move. He just shifted to keep both faces. Amara's calm, the officer's angles inside the rectangle of glass. You could see the math in his eyes. If this is recorded, it's real. If it's real, it can't be buried. "Officer," Amara said, and somehow she made the word mean man instead of uniform. "I've met worse storms than you." The veteran next to me whispered, "Atta girl," like he was talking to his daughter and his country at the same time. Doyle smirked again, but it curdled on his face. Something in the crowd had shifted. It wasn't loud. It was the sound of agreement solidifying like cement setting in a mold. A bailiff stepped through the doorway and took in the scene, with eyes that said he wanted no part of the history that was about to be made. Cross tried one more jab. "Does that metal make you forget your place?" And the words bumped into Luis's phone like they'd hit a wall. That was the last straw for the afternoon's illusions. A veteran in a VFW cap spoke up calmly, like he was reading from a manual. "Her place is wherever she damn well wants it to be," he said, and the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They just held the moment still while it took its own picture. The officers stepped aside as if they'd decided to let traffic pass. It wasn't kindness. It was calculation, some late flicker of this looks bad. Amara rolled through the gap without a glance back, as steady as if she'd rehearsed the route. Luis kept filming until she cleared the bottom step, then dropped the phone to his chest and blew out a breath he'd been saving since the first insult. I saw his thumb move, send, 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 and the world changed speed. The clip hit the internet the way a match hits dry pine. First, it was a local thing, neighbors, veterans groups, a handful of journalists who'd watched the hearing and didn't trust their own rage. Then the hashtags found each other in the wild justice. For Amara, Silver Star, not honor, not hate. At a coffee shop 2 blocks away, screens lit up like auroras. At the VFW hall across town, someone turned up the TV, and the chatter stopped mid-story. By mid-afternoon, my phone was a hive. Messages stacked on messages. "Is this real? You were there. Send me the raw." A producer I hadn't heard from in 3 years called twice without leaving a voicemail, old trick, urgent as a flare. A retired Marine from Ohio posted the clip with 3 words that punched above their weight. "We see you." It got 50,000 shares in an hour. A nurse in El Paso stitched it to a thread about her father's service and wrote, "This is why he kept his medals in a shoebox so no one could tell him where they belonged." The shoebox photo broke me a little. It broke a lot of people. Within hours, someone found the names Ethan Cross and Ryan Doyle. Someone else pulled up formal complaints that hadn't gone anywhere. A third person mapped their unit assignments and the judge's past rulings, and suddenly the comments weren't just about 2 men on a staircase. They were about a system that had gotten used to its own reflection. A national talk show clipped the clip and aired it with the caption, "Who decides who deserves honor?" And just like that, Whitmore's name started trending alongside the officers, the way a tree's shadow announces the tree. Inside the courthouse, I'm told the judge's clerk shut her office door and cried because she knew a tide when she heard it. Outside, veterans began arriving with their own medals, pinned high jackets, unzipped in the cold to make the point visible. No speeches, no chants, just presence. The kind of quiet that's louder than shouting. By evening, the city felt smaller than the conversation it was hosting. Press vans angled across the curb like beach ships. A pastor from a church down the block handed out hot chocolate and said, "We take care of people who take care of us." A teenager in a hoodie asked an old man in a bomber jacket what the ribbons meant, and the old man told him, "Slow, careful," like he was passing down recipes. If you want to know when the spark became a fire, it wasn't the first 1,000 views or the first celebrity retweet. It was when an email list for military families sent the clip with the subject line, "For the ones who served and were told to be small." Replies flooded back, stories of medals kept in drawers of parades, skipped of the complicated weight of pride. The country was not arguing with itself for once. It was remembering, and Whitmore. He tried to pretend it was noise. Brief statement, no questions, the kind of paragraph that says everything without saying anything. But the crowd outside said otherwise. People brought candles. Someone projected the clip on the courthouse wall, silent looping. Every time the line appeared, "History has already passed you," the wind seemed to lean in helpful for once. By nightfall, Luis Vega had a name and 100 interview requests. He answered 2 and turned down the rest. He told a local station, "I didn't do anything brave. I just didn't look away." That sentence traveled as fast as the video hitching a ride on the same current. It made not looking away sound like a thing regular people could do on a Tuesday. I stood across the street with my notebook and stopped pretending I wasn't part of it. I'd come to report a hearing. I was watching the first brick in a wall come loose. 2 officers tried to shrink a woman's life to fit their comfort, and the country told them no. A judge tried to set the stage for humiliation, and the stage refused him. A stranger held up a phone, and a whole lot of strangers saw themselves in the frame. If you'd asked me that morning what would make a nation listen, I'd have guessed speeches, lawsuits, maybe a headline with teeth. Turns out it was smaller and bigger. A staircase, a medal, a voice that didn't waver, and a kid with steady hands. That was the spark. And once it caught, there wasn't enough night in the sky to smother it. I remember the night the first real crack opened. The city outside was quiet in that winter after midnight way, streetlights humming, a stray bus sighing at an empty corner. Amara sat alone in her small apartment, a cup of tea gone cold beside her, the silver star resting on the table like a silent witness. The courthouse storm of the day had barely settled when her laptop chimed with a sound too sharp for the hour. It wasn't a normal email. The subject line was nothing but a string of numbers and symbols, the sender a name she didn't recognize. Inside one sentence, weighted like a trapdoor, "Whitmore has sold justice. I have proof. NC." Beneath it, a single link blinked, faintly encrypted and timed to expire. She told me later her first thought was spam, her second thought a setup. But instinct, the same kind that kept her alive in Syria, told her this was different. She clicked. A dark screen opened, then bloomed into files, hundreds of them. Internal emails stamped with court seals, scans of checks written from Iron Shield Logistics to a charity that didn't exist. Photographs of private meetings in hotel suites where Whitmore's face caught the flash, mid-smile, a glass of scotch in hand. And a memo blunt enough to scrape the breath from her lungs, maintain favorable rulings to secure future contracts. The money trail was clean in its arrogance, millions routed through shells and side accounts, all to keep shoddy military equipment flowing to the field. Equipment that Amara knew had failed men and women like the ones she'd lost. The files went deeper. Maps of a small black neighborhood in West Garrison, color-coded for redevelopment, were pinned to a proposal signed by a familiar name, the judge's brother-in-law. In the margins, someone had written "Use Cross and Doyle" to persuade holdouts. Ethan Cross and Ryan Doyle, those same officers who had sneered at Amara on the courthouse steps, were listed not as enforcers of law, but as private contractors. Notes described midnight visits, evictions, accelerated price adjustments after compliance. It read less like city planning and more like a blueprint for theft. The pieces clicked with a slow, brutal clarity. The judge, his enforcers, a defense company that cut corners until soldiers bled. The same men who mocked her service were part of a pipeline that started with intimidation and ended with profit. The courtroom insult wasn't just personal humiliation, it was strategy. Make her small, discredit the medal, and scare others from speaking. The chat icon in the corner of the screen pulsed. A live message appeared. My name is Noah Chen. I'm a reporter used to be with the Chronicle until I wouldn't kill a story about police rackets. They buried me and think I stopped digging. I didn't. They know I have this. They've been following me for weeks. Your name came up in their calls. We don't have long. Amara's first reply was a single word. Why me? Because you stood in that courtroom and didn't bend. Noah wrote back. Because they're afraid of what you carry and not just the metal. She sat very still. Across the room, the radiator ticked like a slow clock. Outside, a siren wandered off into another burrow. She thought about the faces in those photographs, the signatures on those deals, the soldiers whose last moments smelled of burning wire and sand. Every fact in the files was a life she could almost name. Noah sent one more line I can meet. Public place. Tomorrow. If I disappear, this drops to every major outlet. You deserve to see it first. Before she closed the laptop, Amara laid her palm over the silver star. The metal was cool, but she felt the heat of memory rise her team in the desert, the friend who had covered her body with his own. This metal had never been decoration. It was the last heartbeat of people who trusted her to keep faith. And now somehow those absent voices were asking for more than remembrance. They were asking for action. I wasn't there in that room, but when she later told me I could picture it, the dim lamp, the silent metal, the blue glow of evidence stacking into a case bigger than anyone had guessed. She said she felt the same steadiness she'd felt when the judge tried to strip her, honor only stronger, heavier, as if the choice had already been made long before she opened the email. This wasn't about winning an argument in court anymore. It was about stopping a machine that had fed on the lives of the voiceless and the dead. By the time the laptop screen went dark, Amara had drawn a single breath and whispered to no one. This isn't just my fight. The words stayed in the room like smoke. And somewhere in the city, a man named Noah Chen checked the lock on his door again, knowing that a line had been crossed and that the night had just given birth to a war neither of them could now refuse. The night after that encrypted email felt too still to trust. Snow had thinned to mist, and the long road home stretched black and empty beneath the winter sky. Amara steered her dark SUV the way soldiers move through unfamiliar ground, alert, precise. Every mirror checked, every shadow measured. On the dash, the soft glow of instruments caught the edge of her silver star, a quiet reminder of lives already paid for in blood. Halfway across the old river bridge, the world betrayed her. She pressed the brake to ease into a curve and felt nothing. No catch, no pull, just the pedal collapsing to the floor. The engine surged forward, free of her control. A metallic alarm screamed inside the cabin, a harsh, unbroken wail. Outside, the guardrail burst like a handful of angry stars. The vehicle shuddered, skidded sideways, and slammed to a stop 3 feet from the edge. For a breathless moment, she just listened. Heart fast but steady. The children stared, their breath hanging in the icy air. The crossing guard lowered the flashlight slowly, as if even a sudden movement might wake the nightmare again. Emergency lights washed the bridge in red and blue within minutes. A mechanic slid under the SUV with a flashlight and crawled back out, pale. This isn't wear and tear, he said quietly. Your brake lines were sliced clean, like with a razor. The tow truck driver whistled low. Somebody wanted this to happen. Those words weighed more than the wrecked steel. An accident could be forgiven. This was intent, a hand with a blade, a mind that had chosen the night and the bridge and the children's path. She returned home just before dawn. Exhaustion came. Fear never did. Officers taking her statement wondered how she stayed so composed. They hadn't heard bombs turn a desert air into fire. To Amara, danger was an old dialect she still spoke fluently. Morning brought the next strike. On the welcome mat lay a plain envelope with no return address. Inside, letters cut from newspapers spelled 3 words in a crooked, silent threat. Shut up or die. No greeting, no signature. Just the cold weight of someone certain they could frighten her into silence. Amara placed the envelope beside her silver star on the kitchen table and stared until the room steadied around a decision. Then she pulled a yellow legal pad toward her and began what she later called Operation Truth. She wrote everything, dates and times of court sessions, each exchange with Noah Chen, every call or glance that felt off. She mapped the West Garrison neighborhood, targeted for forced sales, pinning red threads between addresses and the names from Noah's files. She added photos of Judge Whitmore, Ethan Cross, and Ryan Doyle, not as trophies but as coordinates in a pattern of greed and violence. Piece by piece, the walls of her small living room filled with evidence until they looked less like a home and more like a field command center. I saw that room later, and it wasn't paranoia I witnessed. It was discipline, each paper and photograph part of a mission briefing. Amara moved between those walls with the same precise calm she once used to clear a house in a war zone. She was turning trauma into strategy. A friend phoned to beg her to slow down. Amara listened and then said almost to herself, "If I stay silent, the friends I lost died for nothing." It wasn't defiance. It was memory hardened into resolve. Investigators soon found one more piece. Traffic footage from a light near the bridge showed a lone figure leaning against a lamppost minutes before her brakes failed. Hood up, face masked, motionless. The person never touched the car, just watched, then disappeared into the dark. No name, no trail. Only a silhouette to prove what she already knew: someone was watching. That night, Amara pinned the threatening letter at the center of her evidence wall. Around it, she placed photos of fallen teammates' faces that would never age. She touched each image in turn, then rested her hand on the silver star. "This fight isn't just mine," she said quietly, "and it doesn't end with me." Outside, the city slept. Inside, the quiet deepened into something steadier than fear. Operation Truth had begun, and the people who wanted her silent had already failed. Somewhere across town, another pair of eyes might have been waiting, but the battlefield was drawn now, and Amara had already chosen where she would stand. I remember the night Amara decided she wouldn't fight alone. The city was half asleep, streets silvered by frost, when she wheeled quietly into a corner coffee shop that kept its lights low after midnight. The place smelled of roasted beans and wet wool, but no music played, just the slow drip of a leaky faucet and the quiet tick of a clock above the bar. A single figure waited at the back table, laptop, closed eyes scanning every entrance. It was Noah Chen, former investigative reporter, the man who'd sent that encrypted email. They shook hands without small talk and settled in the silence around them, more packed than pause. Noah leaned in first. "You should release everything tonight," he said, voice pitched low. "Dump the files, flood the feeds. They can't erase what the world already knows." His fingers drummed the tabletop, a quiet percussion of urgency. Amara listened without blinking. "And if we drop it now," she asked, "do we win or just scatter the fight?" Her tone wasn't defiance, it was calculation. She spoke like someone who had studied ambushes and knew timing could mean everything. Noah exhaled and sat back. "I've chased a lot of corruption," he admitted, "but I've never seen a machine this big, this ready to bite back. They fired me for digging into smaller stories than this. I've had men follow me home, threaten my family. But even then, it never felt like this, like they'd rather kill the story than bury it." For a long minute, only the clock answered. Then Amara said softly but certain, "We hold until the strike counts. They expect panic. We give them patience." The words landed like a plan. Trust doesn't grow in the dark without effort, and that night both of them tested it. Noah told her about years of dead ends and bruised sources, about editors who caved when the stakes rose about the morning. He found his car window smashed for refusing to kill a piece on police graft. Amara shared less detail, but each sentence carried the weight of war and loss. By the time they left, the space between them felt less like a table and more like a shared trench. The very next day, the counterattack began. A hard-right cable channel ran a breathless exclusive, claiming to have leaked medical records that proved Amara suffered severe PTSD. They called her unstable, dangerous, unfit to appear in court. Anchors spoke in careful tones that dripped with doubt. Screens filled with grainy photos and half-finished sentences. But veterans across the country refused the script. Within hours, former Marines, Army medics, and fellow SEALs posted their own messages. "Healing isn't weakness. Courage isn't measured by scars." A retired colonel wrote, "If PTSD disqualified heroism, half the monuments in this country would be empty." Their words cut cleaner than any fact check. By evening, the hashtag "Your Honor Not Stigma" trended beside "Justice for Amara," and the smear collapsed under its own weight. That night, Amara called home. Her mother answered on the second ring voice, tremulous but steady. "Are you safe?" she asked. "I am," Amara said, and then paused. "And I'm still keeping the promise I made to protect what's right wherever it takes me." There was silence on the line, the kind that holds more than words. Then her mother whispered, "Your father would be proud." And Amara heard the soft catch of tears she knew her mother didn't want her to hear. "I'm proud too," her mother added finally. "Just come back when it's time." When the call ended, Amara stayed by the window for a long while, watching a slow flurry of snow brush the city. The conversation left a quiet strength in its wake, the kind only family can give a reminder of why this fight was worth every risk. Outside her apartment, the story was growing beyond her own name. Veterans groups organized vigils on courthouse steps from Boston to Seattle. Neighbors who had never met a SEAL wrote letters to editors and to Congress. A retired nurse in Georgia posted a photo of her husband's folded flag with the words, "We stand with Amara." Students at a Midwest university printed flyers that read, "Justice wears many uniforms." By week's end, hundreds of thousands of people, veterans and civilians alike, had joined the call. They weren't just defending one woman or one medal. They were demanding that the institutions built to protect them stop preying on them. The movement gave Amara something even Iron Shield's money couldn't buy: a nation's attention, and a sense that the ground beneath the powerful was starting to shift. From that midnight meeting to the swelling chorus online, the pattern was clear. The more Whitmore's allies tried to isolate Amara through intimidation, false leaks, or quiet threats, the more people stepped forward to close ranks around her. And as the circle of support widened, so did her resolve. What began as a single encrypted email had become a living network of witnesses and defenders. I can still see the way she described it later, like standing in a current that kept getting stronger, no matter how many stones they threw in to stop it. The next move wouldn't be rushed. It would be precise. And when it came, the judge who had tried to shrink a hero to silence would discover that patience too can be a weapon. The first meeting between Amara and Noah happened long after the city had gone quiet. It was close to midnight when she rolled into a dim coffee shop that sat on the edge of an empty street. The sign buzzed softly, the only sound beyond the slow drip of a leaky faucet behind the counter. At a corner table half hidden in shadow, Noah Chen waited with a closed laptop and a single cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. They greeted each other like people who already knew the stakes. Noah leaned forward, his voice a low rasp. "We need to release everything now," he said. "Get it out before they can shut you down. Once it's public, they can't erase it." He spoke like someone used to racing the clock. Amara listened, steady and unhurried. "And if we do it now," she asked, "does it end the fight or scatter it?" Her tone wasn't defiance, but careful strategy. She'd led teams through chaos before. Timing, she knew, was everything. Noah's eyes flicked to the window as if expecting shadows to move. "I've chased corruption for years," he admitted. "Lost jobs, lost friends. I've had strangers follow me home / my tires threaten my family. But this," he tapped the laptop, "this is bigger than anything I've seen. They'd rather kill the story than bury it." The room seemed to tighten around those words. Outside, a snowplow passed its slow rumble, fading back into silence. Amara finally said, "If we strike too early, they'll call it rumor. We wait for the moment they can't dodge. We make every word undeniable." It wasn't a question, it was a decision. Trust is a fragile thing, especially at that hour. They spent the next hour trading histories like soldiers comparing scars. Noah spoke of being pushed out of the Chronicle after refusing to kill a piece on police graft of phone calls with no voice on the other end of a night he came home to find every window in his car smashed. He smiled without humor. "I kept thinking it couldn't get worse. Now I know better." Amara offered fewer stories but carried more weight. Every sentence was quiet, steel dessert, nights under fire, comrades who never came back. The cost of standing firm when others demanded silence. By the time they rose to leave, trust had settled between them, not loud, but solid. The very next morning, the counterattack came. A hard-right cable channel announced an exclusive waiving what they claimed were leaked medical records that proved Amara suffered severe PTSD. Anchors spoke in careful tones that dripped with suggestion: unstable, dangerous, unfit to testify. Grainy photos and half-finished charts flashed across screens while pundits questioned her judgment. But the smear collapsed almost as quickly as it spread. Veterans from every branch responded within hours. A retired Marine posted, "If PTSD disqualified courage, half the monuments in this country wouldn't exist." An Army medic wrote, "Healing isn't weakness. Courage isn't the absence of wounds." The hashtag Watch Your Honor Not Stigma trended alongside Justice for Amara, and what had begun as an attack turned into a rallying cry for the strength of those who carry invisible scars. That evening, seeking a quieter kind of strength, Amara called home. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Are you safe?" she asked, voice low but firm. "I am," Amara said, "and I'm still keeping my promise to protect what's right wherever this leads." There was a pause that felt like a held breath. Then her mother whispered, "Your father would be proud," and a soft sound followed a single tear caught by the phone line. "I'm proud too," she added, steady now. "Just come back when it's time." When the call ended, Amara stayed by the window watching thin flakes of snow spiral under the streetlights. That quiet exchange, love without conditions, faith without demands, gave her a calm deeper than any headline or hashtag. It was the kind of strength no opponent could measure. Outside, the story kept growing. Veterans groups organized candlelight vigils on courthouse steps from Boston to Seattle. Neighbors who had never met a Navy SEAL wrote letters to editors and legislators. A retired nurse in Georgia posted a photo of her late husband's folded flag with the words, "We stand with Amara." Students at a Midwestern university printed flyers that read, "Justice wears many uniforms." By the week's end, hundreds of thousands of people, veterans and civilians alike, had joined the call. They weren't only defending one woman or one medal, they were demanding that the institutions built to protect them stop preying on them. What began as a midnight meeting between two determined strangers had become a nationwide movement, a current of support too wide for any smear to contain. Later, Amara would describe it as standing in a river that only gained strength no matter how many stones they threw in to stop it. The next move, she knew, would have to be precise. And when it came, the judge who tried to shrink a war hero into silence would discover that patience and the truth could strike harder than any sudden attack. Dawn broke cold and sharp the morning Amara returned to court. The streets around the courthouse were still wrapped in blue shadow when she arrived, her wheelchair whispering over the frosted bricks. The silver star on her chest caught the early light like a flare. People were already gathered, veterans in worn field jackets, neighbors clutching coffee, reporters with cameras balanced like rifles on their shoulders. As she rolled past the steps, a low murmur swept through the crowd, the sound of strangers united by something larger than curiosity. Inside, the air tightened. Every head turned as she crossed the marble floor. Court clerks paused mid-step, and the bailiff who had watched her defy the judge the first time straightened without thinking. The quiet wasn't the hush of routine. It was the deep intake of breath before a storm breaks. Amara moved to the clerk's desk and produced a thick folder bound in dark blue. For the record, she said, her voice clear, but without theatrics. The clerk accepted the documents with both hands. Inside were the pieces of a puzzle too sharp to ignore: emails showing bribes from Iron Shield Logistics, maps of West Garrison, with forced eviction notes, photographs of a neatly sliced brake line. The anonymous letter that read, "Shut up or die." Copies went not only into the court file, but to a row of waiting journalists whose cameras blinked awake in unison. Then she wheeled forward to the defense table and faced Judge Harold Whitmore. He leaned back, eyes narrow, the faintest smile cutting across his face. "You've turned this courtroom into a stage," he said, each word meant to belittle, to restore the old balance of power. Amara didn't blink. "No," she answered, voice even as steel. "I'm turning it into the truth." The line hung in the air like a struck bell. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Reporters froze mid-note. A veteran in the front row folded his cap against his chest. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. It was as if the building itself was considering which side of the sentence it belonged on. Whitmore's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the moment had already shifted. The judge's bench, once a symbol of unshakable authority, now looked less like a throne and more like a witness stand. Power had begun to slide away from the man in robes toward the woman in the wheelchair. Flashbulbs cracked like summer lightning. Outside, the crowd swelled, their voices rising until the courthouse windows trembled. Hashtags sparked across phones: Sabotage, Truth for Amara, Charan, Justice in Uniform. Newsrooms across the country interrupted broadcasts to carry the live feed. What began as a hearing was now a national reckoning unfolding in real time. Whitmore tried to reclaim the room with procedure. He cleared his throat, shuffled papers, called for order. But each attempt sounded smaller than the last. Every rustle of paper seemed to underline what everyone already felt: the center of gravity had moved. A veteran in the gallery whispered, "This is history," and the words rippled outward like a tide. Amara remained still, her hands folded lightly in her lap, gaze steady. She didn't need to raise her voice. The evidence spoke louder than any outburst could. Every photo, every email, every map on that table was a fuse already lit. By the time the morning sun reached the high windows, the entire courtroom felt different. The heavy silence was no longer deference to the judge. It was the charged quiet of people witnessing the balance of justice tilt before their eyes. And in that charged quiet, Amara's presence filled the room. She had entered like a quiet storm. Now she sat at its calm center, the silver star gleaming against her uniform, a living proof that truth, patiently gathered and fearlessly delivered, could move walls that once seemed unmovable. The gavel in Whitmore's hand was no longer a weapon. It was just wood. Outside chants of justice for Amara rolled like distant thunder, each call stronger than the one before. Inside, the judge's bench seemed smaller with every breath. Power, real lasting power, had changed seats, and everyone from the lowest clerk to the highest camera in the room knew it. The morning after Amara's explosive return to court, the counterstrike came fast and loud. Two familiar names, Ethan Cross and Ryan Doyle, surfaced on a late-night broadcast framed by the glare of a studio built for outrage. They claimed to have new evidence proving that Amara Lewis had incited violence outside the courthouse. The anchor waved a packet of papers they called an internal report, alleging that the viral videos were doctored and that Amara had staged a riot to smear law enforcement. Their voices were sharp, confident, rehearsed. For a few uneasy hours, it looked, at least to casual watchers, like the story might pivot. Headlines flashed words like incitement and fake footage. A handful of pundits speculated about manipulated narratives, the kind of phrases designed to plant doubt without proof. The tactic was obvious: make the public question what they'd seen with their own eyes, and maybe the truth would shrink to a matter of opinion. But West Garrison had been watching too, and they had their own cameras. By noon, residents were flooding social media with uncut clips from every angle of that day outside the courthouse. Storefront security footage, cell phone videos from bystanders, audio files with clear timestamps. Each piece told the same story. No riot, no provocation, just two officers cornering a veteran and a crowd standing witness. A grandmother posted a quiet video from her stoop saying simply, "I was there. They're lying." It went viral within an hour. It wasn't just the images. Testimonies poured in like hammer blows. Teachers, shopkeepers, veterans, parents. Each statement was another strike against the wall of falsehood. A retired judge even released a signed affidavit verifying the chain of evidence. The supposed internal report began to look like what it was: a sheet of paper built to burn. National media picked up the scent. By evening, major networks were running deep dive segments, tracing years of questionable rulings back to Judge Whitmore. Investigative reporters connected the dots between forced evictions in black neighborhoods, suspicious real estate deals, and the Iron Shield contracts that lined private pockets while soldiers died with faulty gear. What had started as a narrow courtroom clash now unfolded as a systemic map of exploitation. The public response outpaced even the reporters. From New York to Texas, veterans gathered on courthouse steps for candlelight vigils and quiet marches. They wore their own medals outside winter coats, some pinning silver stars to their hats, others carrying handmade signs that read, "We fight with her." Photos swept across social feeds: a Vietnam vet saluting in the snow, a young Marine standing at attention with his toddler perched on his shoulders. No shouting, no chaos, just a steady, visible refusal to look away. By midweek, the false report was in shreds. Fact-checkers dismantled it, line by line. Journalists tracked the document's origins to a private security contractor tied to Iron Shield. Even a few law and order commentators, initially cautious, conceded on air that the evidence was a fabrication. The more Cross and Doyle pushed, the more credibility they lost. What they had framed as a rescue operation for their reputations began to look like a confession of guilt, and the backlash didn't stop with them. The very act of trying to discredit Amara accelerated the unraveling of the larger machine. Federal lawmakers called for hearings. State investigators announced new subpoenas. A joint task force began reviewing every case Judge Whitmore had touched in the last decade, including dozens of suspiciously lenient sentences for corporate polluters and connected landlords. On the courthouse lawn in West Garrison, people gathered again not to protest but to bear witness. A banner stretched between two lampposts read simply, "Truth needs no permission." At dusk, a veteran lit a single candle and passed the flame along the line. No speeches, just quiet fire spreading hand to hand. By the time the week closed, the so-called counterattack had become its own indictment. What was meant to discredit a single woman ended up exposing an entire system of corruption and intimidation. The internal report that Cross and Doyle waved on television became Exhibit A in the growing federal case against Whitmore and his allies. Instead of slowing the tide, their gambit deepened the current. Watching it unfold, you could feel the shift. The judge who once ruled from a high bench was now being investigated from the ground up. His allies had tried to paint Amara as reckless and unstable. Instead, they had proven the strength of her case and the patience of her supporters. What began as an attempt to rewrite a single afternoon ended as a nationwide demand for justice, louder, steadier, and far more dangerous to those who had something to hide. The storm they unleashed never turned back. Every false word they spoke became another reason for the country to listen more closely to Amara's truth and to stand beside her until that truth was written line by line into the record they could no longer control. They came just after sunrise when the courthouse steps were still slick with frost and the coffee in people's hands sent up pale threads of steam. First one black SUV, then another, then a quiet procession that filled the curb like punctuation periods at the end of a long, loud sentence. Men and women in dark coats stepped out, badges kept close eyes scanning not with drama, but with the calm of people who've done this before. The crowd fell into a hush that wasn't fear so much as recognition. The federal line had been crossed. The federal line had arrived. Inside, the temperature of the building seemed to drop a few degrees. The agents set down thick folders that thunked against the defense table. Subpoenas, affidavits, chain of custody logs with no loose threads to tug. Names were called in voices that didn't ask Judge Harold Whitmore. Officer Ethan Cross, Officer Ryan Doyle. Each of them stood where defendants stand, not where authority used to sit. Even the bailiff's posture changed shoulders, tipping ever so slightly toward the people with the paperwork. The hearing began without ceremony. A screen dropped from the ceiling like a lid closing. The first video rolled the courthouse steps, the insults, the slow, awful clarity of words no one could unsay. The clip played once, then again. On the third pass, an agent narrated timestamps and angles, storefront cameras, a traffic cam, a bystander's phone knitting the footage into a single fabric that wouldn't tear. Then came the emails. A projector threw them against the wall in stark black and white. Subject lines like signposts, threads that ran for months. In one, a fixer typed with sloppy confidence, "Whitmore always plays ball." The sentence hung in the courtroom harder than any slur. You could feel the oxygen thin. Always the agent read and let the word do its work. No hedging, no one-off, a habit. Whitmore tried to look bored, then above it, then amused. None of the faces fit anymore. The robe on his shoulders had never seemed smaller. His attorney objected on grounds that sounded technical enough to persuade a textbook, but the judge presiding, a visiting federal judge with the patience of stone, overruled, overruled, overruled. The gavel wasn't a weapon today. It was a metronome keeping time while the facts advanced. Cross and Doyle went next. An agent laid out phone records like rails, a neat line from the internal report on television to a private contractor with ties to Iron Shield, and from there to a meeting in a steakhouse booth with a back door. The receipts were boring in the way the truth often is, tables times tips. Boring until you add context and then you have a route map for a lie. Someone in the gallery whispered "Lord," and it sounded more like a sigh than a prayer. The day might have ended right there with a stack of evidence and a silence heavy as wet wool. It didn't, because arrogance is impatient. During a recess, Whitmore left the courtroom through a side corridor and made a call from a dim alcove between two portraits. The agent he phoned had his line patched for consented monitoring. That part matters. The tape isn't a secret. It's a record. Listen, Whitmore said, pitching his voice into the register where favors get traded. There's a way to keep this from becoming political theater. I have friends who can make certain appropriations less complicated if cooler heads prevail. You understand me? The agent didn't answer, not out loud. He didn't need to. The red light on the recorder did the listening. The call lasted 1 minute, 23 seconds, long enough to say everything that needed saying. When the court reconvened, the U.S. attorney asked permission to play a brief audio exhibit. The judge granted it. The gallery leaned forward as if pulled by string. Whitmore looked briefly confused, then furious. Then something past both caught. The sound wasn't dramatic. Phones ring. Men talk. In between, a career unspools. When the clip ended, the room stayed silent for a full 3 beats. The visiting judge glanced at Whitmore's counsel, then at Whitmore, then down at the bench as if reading instructions none of us could see. We'll take that into consideration, she said, and you could hear her not making a speech. Speeches were for people who needed convincing. She didn't. Outside politics did what politics does. A handful of lawmakers went on air to suggest caution, to warn against rushing to judgment, to float phrases like isolated incident and media frenzy. It might have landed on another week in another year. This week it sank. The hashtag Wash Honor Justice climbed the boards braided with Ash and Truth for Amara, and Ash Honor Not Stigma, and the talking points read like paper boats in a current. Veterans recorded short videos, no edits, no music, saying simply what they'd seen and what they expected from a country they'd carried on their backs. Reporters asked Amara about risk, as if danger could be measured like blood pressure. She didn't blink. I've walked through minefields, she said. I don't leave this one because someone thinks they own the map. It wasn't a line for cameras. It was a fact. I watched her in that moment and understood something I had been circling since the first day. Her calm wasn't the absence of fear. It was a choice she made and remade, the way a diver chooses breath, the way a surgeon chooses steadiness. The building felt it too. Clerks moved with quieter urgency. Officers stood a touch straighter. Even the ceilings, high and echoing, seemed less impressed with themselves. By late afternoon, the federal team had built a lattice sturdy enough to bear weight video emails, money trails, and attempted political arrangement recorded clean. The U.S. attorney filed a motion to suspend Whitmore pending formal charges. Cross and Doyle were ordered to surrender their service weapons and badges until further notice. A murmur ran the edge of the room, shock relief, the first exhale after a long, hard hold. And still nothing was finished. The judge set a hearing for the next morning. The crowd outside swelled again, not loud, not wild, just present. Candles, flags, a few hand-lettered signs. A woman in a nurse's scrubs stood beside a man in a flight jacket, and they didn't need to talk to agree about what mattered. As we stepped into the early dark, phones lit our faces. Notifications stacked, analysis pieces, statements from advocacy groups, a brief press release from Iron Shield, so careful it said nothing at all. A teenager near me scrolled and whispered, "It's really happening." An older man answered, "It's been happening. We just caught up." That night felt different from the others. Not calmer, nothing about this was calm, but steadier, as if the country had found its feet under it. We all knew the next day could bring more maneuvers, more shadows, another twist. That's how power behaves when cornered. But the center had shifted and wouldn't shift back. Before I went home, I looked up at the courthouse windows. Somewhere inside, Amara was meeting with the federal team, her notes neat, her voice level. Somewhere else, Whitmore was sitting very still, the day finally loud in his head. Across the street, a child on her father's shoulders pointed at the building and asked a question I couldn't hear. The father answered with patience and a small, tired smile. We were past the point where anyone could pretend this was about one exchange on one morning. The SUVs had come, the record had spoken, and an entire nation stood on the lip of a decision, waiting for the gavel to be what it was supposed to be, just wood meeting. Wood to mark the moment the truth took its rightful seat. The final day began under a sky the color of cold steel. Crowds filled every sidewalk for blocks, flags snapping in a dry wind, candles from last night's vigil still smoldering in metal cups. News vans lined the street like sentinels. Inside the courthouse, the air felt dense with waiting reporters shifting their weight, veterans standing at quiet attention, ordinary citizens clutching phones that trembled with live feeds. Everyone knew this would be more than a hearing. It would be the reckoning. When the doors opened, Harold Whitmore walked in no longer as a judge but as a defendant. Gone was the robe that once wrapped him in authority. He wore a plain suit that seemed to sag under the weight of the cameras. His face had the gray cast of someone who hasn't slept, and he kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, avoiding the gallery. The man who had once commanded silence with a gavel now flinched at the scrape of a chair. Then Amara entered. She wore a dress uniform white as winter sunlight, the silver star gleaming on her chest. The sound of her wheelchair on the marble floor, steady, deliberate, echoed through the chamber, like the measured roll of a battle drum. People turned as if drawn by a current. For a moment, no one breathed. It was not spectacle, it was witness. When the court was called to order, the presiding federal judge invited Amara to testify. She rolled forward without haste, stopped before the bench and faced the room. Her voice carried with the clarity of a bell struck in cold air. "I lost a part of my body to keep this flag standing," she began. "If justice allows a man like Harold Whitmore to remain unchallenged, then justice itself is dead. I am here to keep it alive." The words didn't rise to a shout. They didn't need to. Each syllable landed like a heartbeat, steady and undeniable. For a long second, silence claimed the room. Then someone stood, then another. In moments, the entire courtroom was on its feet, reporters, veterans, clerks applauding, not like an audience, but like a people remembering what their own oaths meant. The sound built until it filled the rafters and spilled through the doors into the street. Outside, the response was immediate and immense. Thousands of voices joined as one, "Justice for Amara." "Justice for Amara" silver stars flashed in the sunlight, pinned to coats and hats and handmade banners. The broad avenue in front of the courthouse became a sea of honor and resolve, a living echo of the courage inside. Back in the chamber, the evidence spoke with equal force. Agents presented the trail of bribes, the forced evictions, the doctored videos, the taped attempt at a political arrangement. Every defense offered by Whitmore's lawyers collapsed under the weight of his own words and signatures. Ethan Cross and Ryan Doyle sat stone-faced as recordings of their threats and falsified reports played for the court, each clip another nail in the case. The presiding judge read the decision with the gravity of a closing door. Effective immediately, Harold Whitmore is suspended from all judicial duties and will face federal criminal charges. A second order followed without pause. Officers Ethan Cross and Ryan Doyle are hereby remanded into federal custody on counts of conspiracy, abuse of power, and endangerment of life. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped forward. The clink of handcuffs echoed across the chamber, clean, unhurried, final. Amara remained still. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. Instead, she placed her hand over the silver star fingers, resting lightly on the metal as if to anchor the memory of every life behind it. The quiet of that gesture spoke louder than celebration. It said that justice, when it is real, doesn't require revenge. It requires truth and the courage to stand inside it. Outside, the chants rolled on, swelling until they became a single continuous sound that wrapped the courthouse like a living wall. People lifted medals to the sky. Children sat on their parents' shoulders and shouted the words as if they already knew they would carry them into the future. By nightfall, the hashtag #Justice for Amara had circled the globe. Editorials called the day a turning point. Law schools planned to teach it as a case study. Veterans groups announced scholarships in her name. For millions, watching the story had become more than a headline. It was proof that one person's steady refusal to bow could realign the meaning of justice itself. As the chamber emptied, Amara stayed for a moment longer. The light through the high windows caught the edges of her uniform, and she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had been won and what would still need guarding. When she finally wheeled toward the exit, the sound of the crowd outside met her like an embrace. That night, the city felt changed. Not louder, not calmer, just steadier, as if the country had drawn a deeper breath. The day would be remembered not only for a verdict, but for a truth made visible that real justice doesn't need a weapon, only the persistence of fact and the courage to stand when standing is hardest. And long after the gavel's echo faded, the movement she sparked kept growing, a living proof that courage once spoken does not end. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Amara's journey reminds us that real justice isn't about titles or uniforms. It's about truth, courage, and the quiet strength to stand when standing is hardest. Her voice proved that one person's resolve can spark a movement and keep the meaning of justice alive for all of us. If this story moved you, please like this video and share it with friends and family so her message of honor and hope can travel even farther. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful, true-to-life narratives that stand for courage and fairness. Every click of support, every like, share, and subscription gives our team the inspiration to keep creating meaningful stories that lift hearts and challenge injustice. This is Mr. Mac's Stories, where truth and courage